Hello, my name is Daryl Robert Shune, and I'd like to announce that the event that was scheduled for April 4th and 5th in London, Money, Rock, Paper, Scissors, is going to be rescheduled because of the coronavirus emergency and the uprooting of travel plans and other such things. So please stay tuned. Sandeep and I will be doing a series of interviews during this time, and this is serious, folks. We're in it together. Hello, my name is Daryl Robert Shune, and today the topic, Buckminster Fuller, the crises without precedent, and C60 is going to form the context of what we're going to talk about. But in talking about this, I do have to bring up my friend Marshall Thurber. And if you want some background on my relationship with Marshall and various aspects of my story, I can think of, you might want to go to my to this YouTube channel called New Thinking Aloud with Jeffrey Mishlev. And I've done a number of interviews with Jeffrey beginning in December of 2019. We did, I think, 4 interviews at that time, and they were met quite positively. And in those interviews, I talk about Marshall and many of the things that people who have read my writings on economics and seen my videos have not been privy to. But Jeffrey seemed to bring that stuff out of me. I've known Jeffrey since 1971. And in the interim, when I was doing my life, Jeffrey became an author of an extraordinary book called Roots of Consciousness, and had a TV channel on PBS called Thinking Aloud, and now has a new channel on YouTube called New Thinking Aloud, and he began that in 2015, and already he has gotten over 7 million views. And in December, Jeffrey, late last fall, Jeffrey asked me to come for some interviews, triggered by a conspiracy book I had written, and Jeffrey found it quite interesting, and he said, why don't you come and we'll film this and on the nature of conspiracy theories. And so we did, and we had a good time with it, and I've done a series more. But if you go back to New Thinking Aloud with Jeffrey Mishlev and Google that name and my name, you'll come up with the interviews that he's done with me and find out more about that part of my life. But I want to sort of bring it fast forward, my relationship with Marshall, because he has everything to do with my knowing about Bucky Fuller. Marshall and I met in law school at Hastings Law School in 1966. Marshall wanted to change the world, Aries full of energy, and I was already by then an embittered political radical, and I didn't want to have anything to do with it. I knew I was outnumbered at least, and certainly the powers that be were not on my side. So I didn't want to have anything to do with Marshall's ideas, but he said, listen, I want you to write an article for Hastings Law School newspaper. So I did. Marshall put it on the front page of Voir Dire, the newspaper, and almost got kicked out of school for doing it. The lawyers among you will find some humor in it, as the title of my article on the front page of the Hastings Law School newspaper was Church Liable for Acts of God. That's what got Marshall almost kicked out of law school. Anyway, he had a stronger stomach for dissonance than most people did, and we remained good friends throughout all these years. In fact, it was Marshall who convened the Positive Deviant Network and invited Martha and I to join this group of what he said were high-achieving, out-of-the-box thinkers in 2004. And so we did. And we would meet 4 times a year, and it was at this group, the Positive Deviant Network, that I delivered my paper in March 2007, where I predicted a severe economic crisis was upon us and about to happen, and gave my reasons for so doing. That book was ordered by readers in 22 countries, and it put me on the map. But what really put me on the map was the articles I began writing in gold and silver on financial sites were picked up around the world. And in fact, that's what brought me back to Jeffrey Mishlev's attention. We had met, we had seen each other the last time in 1994, and all of a sudden, in 2008, I get an email from Jeffrey, and it said this: Jeffrey, he said, Daryl, I've been subscribing to Richard Russell's Dow Theory letter for years, And he just quoted somebody named Daryl Shun on money. Is this you? And I could understand Jeffrey's shock that somebody named Daryl Shun, the exact name of his friend that he'd known since 1971, who had a Chinese restaurant in Berkeley, various other things, all of a sudden appeared, quoted extensively by Richard Russell, one of the, he had the oldest theory, Dow theory newsletter in existence, and was highly esteemed in the world of finance. And there was those articles that got me on the stage in terms of giving me an audience in terms of economic prediction and theory and thought, and which has brought me here today. But it was Marshall who put that group together. Well, what happened a year and a half later is that the PDN met again in Torrance, California, and Marshall had Bucky's World Game as the focal point of that getting together. And there was a lot of controversy about who Marshall was going to invite to speak, to headline that conference. And he was bringing in somebody who I had a lot of problems with, a right-wing boy who was talking about private property, and I felt this was an abomination since private property was one of the things that Bucky Fuller said was the abomination of this whole world. Now, I know many of you are going to find a lot of opposition to this, but if you read Bucky, you'll find out his reasons why. Bucky was not a socialist. He was not a communist. He was a humanitarian. And he considered that basically private property was used, the idea of private property was not wrong per se, but was used by those in humanity who wanted everything for themselves. And if you look at the disparity of wealth on the planet this time, where the top 1% owns, what did I say, 80% of the planet, you might think there is a disparity. And if you don't, it's because you're one of the little people floating to the bottom hoping that you're going to win your trip to the top echelons one of these days and don't want the game changed before you get your chance at it. Let me tell you, you're not having your chance. That the 1% is going to lose what they have very, very soon also, because this catastrophic collapse is going to take everybody down. The introduction to Bucky Fuller's book was titled Twilight of the World's Power Structures. And in that introduction, he said all the power structures of humanity were going to collapse. And he said this included financial, political, and religious. They were all going to collapse. And a better world would evolve from it if humanity made the right choices. He said humanity now the universe was considering whether or not to allow us to keep going, because our activities had become so dysfunctional that we were threatened. We were no longer performing what our role was, which was to solve problems, because we'd been diverted and basically we're well along in destroying our own home planet. That was Bucky's point of view. So I had never really given a lot of thought to Bucky. Marshall had been a personal friend of Bucky's. He had met him in the late 1970s and became very, very close to Bucky. And I knew this. But in my mind, Bucky was an idealist. I loved his heart. I loved his thinking. I would consider him sort of unrealistic. But I didn't know anything about him. I mean, we all have judgments about things we know very little about, and that doesn't mean that we don't have judgments about him. Those judgments preclude understanding, but nonetheless, that's what we all do. And I had mine about Bucky until 2008 in the fall when the PDN met. And Marshall, instead of inviting that proponent of private property, invited my friend, Professor Antal Fekete, who came to the conference in Torrance, California. Marshall flew him in from Europe, and Antal basically told us why he believed the economy was beginning to collapse. We were 1 month into it, and why it was doing so. Well, what happened is, at that conference, at that seminar, Marshall had us read parts of Bucky Fuller's book, Critical Path. And what I read about Bucky transformed my view of him. Bucky was known as a futurist. He could see the future. I mean, Marshall said one of the things that he made a list of predictions in the 1930s, and 48 of the 50 came true. All right? Well, in that book, Bucky said that he made sure that his predictions were over 50 years in the future because he did not want to draw the attention of the power structure. He knew that the world that he saw coming was a threat to those now currently in power. Now, let me tell you something about Bucky. Those in power thought highly of him. He consulted not only with the U.S. government, he was a high position during the 1930s and 1940s, during World War II. He was consulted by governments all over the planet, including the USSR, because Bucky was ideologically neutral. He was a humanitarian, all right? And he thought neither that capitalism nor communism was going to get us there. In fact, they stood in the way. And that's why he said we're going to see the collapse of the existing power structures of the world before that better world came into being. Well, so be it. I was stunned when I read this about Bucky, because I realized he was far more aware of power than I thought him to be. I majored in political science at UC Davis, and I've been focused on power ever since then. Power, money, gold, etc. And I knew who had it and who didn't. And the fact this told me an aspect of Bucky's side that I had never seen before. So I then began reading him more intensely. Well, I never read him before 2008. My book, Critical Path, that was given to me by Marshall, is dog-eared and has all these reference points in it. I can tell you, I understand, I believe fully what Bucky Fuller said in that book and warned us about what was going to happen, which is exactly happening now. The coronavirus, I believe, is part of that crisis. I told Marshall, because he was really upset about my take on Bucky. Marshall's wants to see the positive thing, wants to see all the good things that's going to happen. And I said, listen, Marshall, you knew Bucky personally, and you knew that he had no hyperbole. Bucky used words as tools to convey to us the truths that he thought that were real, so we could make the decisions based not on what he thought. He wanted us to think and arrive at our own conclusions. He did not want to influence us from our own decision making. Bucky said he made sure that he did not go and tell other people what to think. He wanted people to ask him, and then he would tell those of us who asked him, or Marshall, etc., what he thought, and he would say it. But he was not trying to sell his point of view like so many others on this planet. Everybody else is trying to do that. Bucky didn't. But Bucky said this crisis would be unprecedented. And so with the advent of the coronavirus, I believe that is another critical step in the path. Now, the coronavirus is, China seems to have, escaped. That's the wrong word. They went through this. They now are seeing their transmissions rate drop. South Korea is an extreme crisis. Italy is an extreme crisis. Yesterday or this morning, we just heard that the NBA is now banning all spectators at their games. All right? Conferences are being canceled, things like that. Martha and I are still, at this time, going to London in early April, where I'm going to speak on these very things. And the reason why also involves Bucky. But I want to tell you a little bit about Marshall again, Bucky Fuller, and C60. And this is not off topic. This is why I believe is going to allow us to go as safe as we can be to London next month. 2 years ago, in January, Marshall called Martha up, my wife, and said, and we've known Marshall a long time. In fact, Martha was back at Marshall's event in 1982 when he had Bucky Fuller there for a week, and that's where she met him. I went up there too, but basically moved Bucky off. He talked at a rate that I couldn't. It was so slow I had no patience for, and walked out of the room. And it was only till it was way too late to hear him in person that I began to take him seriously. But she was there in 1982 at Kirkwood Meadows at Marshall's week-long Brooklyn Business School, where he featured Buckminster Fuller. Well, Marshall called up 2 years ago and told Martha that he was sending her a bottle of C60. 2 days before, he had no idea what it was. The day before, Marshall said somebody sent him a bottle of C60 and said this may be a gift from Bucky from the past. Well, Marshall knew about C60 because in 1979, in a conversation he had with Bucky, Bucky was explaining to Marshall about the weaknesses of the structural weaknesses of a square, that it would push under, it would bend under pressure. And he said, Marshall, there's a structure that is going to be of a molecule that will be the strongest and lightest molecule in existence. And he built a model with Marshall. Marshall said Bucky built the model, but Marshall helped him. And it was what is now known as C60. He built the model in 1979. C60 was discovered in 1985. And at the time when Bucky built this molecule for Marshall, he said, listen, this is going to be the lightest, strongest molecule in existence, and someday it will be used in medicine. Well, as Marshall said, he heard a lot of stuff from Bucky, outrageous stuff. That's why he hung about him and really didn't make any note of it at the time. But he remembered later, and we've seen that molecule that Bucky made, Martha and I have, at Marshall's house. But anyway, in 1985, 3 scientists discovered C60 in the lab, and they were given the Nobel Prize in 1996 for their discovery. But and they began investigating its uses in medicine during this time. But unfortunately, you couldn't really patent it because it was it wasn't commonly occurring, but you couldn't patent the process because it existed in nature. They found it in Shungite in Russia, all right, in a 600, it's huge deposit somewhere, outside of the town of Shunga. And I think it's the only place where C60 was known to exist. But it was found there in 1991. But anyway, this person sent Marshall a bottle of C60. Marshall had no idea what to do with it. He took what the recommended dose was, and he said to Martha in the phone call, he woke up this morning and he knew something was different. And he lay there in bed and he couldn't figure out what it was, and then he realized his knees didn't hurt. Marshall had knee surgery on both knees, which left him in a state of pain, acute pain, for 2 years. He could no longer ski. He could barely get around. He was hobbling when we'd seen him at Thanksgiving. But because he had come here at Thanksgiving, he also knew that Martha was using the cane to get around and waiting for hip replacement surgery. And so when he discovered that the C60, the bottle of C60 that he had taken, made his pain go away, he overnighted Martha a bottle of C60. She took it. Her pain went away. Now, this was rather dramatic. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who knew Marshall, and I didn't tell him about C60, but he said, "What's Marshall doing?" I told him the story about C60. My friend Jeff said, "Daryl," he said, "I've had a congenital hip problem, and they dealt with it in my youth when I was a kid. And they told my mother it was going to come back." Well, Jeff is in his 70s like I am, and he said, "Daryl, it's back, and it really hurts." So I told him about this C60. Jeff sent away for it on his own. He took it. His pain went away. Well, I had no pain, but I began reading a tremendous amount about C60, this molecule that Buckminster Fuller had predicted, a class of molecules that was named fullerenes in honor of Buckminster Fuller because they resembled geodesic domes, which had been invented by Bucky Fuller. And these little molecules were called Bucky balls. And so we went off. Marshall assembled a team. He wanted to know what was going on. Marshall's very, very intense. And so for the next 2 years, next year and a half, we ordered equipment. We did experiments. I sent samples of C60 to laboratories to test the molecule size. Martha took more brands of C60 than anybody I knew. And basically, everybody was trying to follow the body rat study. Because the body rat study, which had published in 2012, they were giving these rats C60 to find out how much C60 would kill them. But instead of killing them, the rats lived 90% longer. And when they did die, they were dissected, no tumors, and no pneumonia. Those were the hallmarks. All Worcester laboratory rats die generally of tumors and pneumonia. When they dissected these rats, there was no sign of pneumonia, no sign of tumor. This was published in 2012 and caused a firestorm on the web, which led ultimately to a lot of manufacturers, people, replicating the body rat study, putting 80 micrograms of crystalline black refined C60 powder in a solution of olive oil because C60 is not soluble in water, so they dissolved it in olive oil, and they put as much in as they could to kill the rats. So the C60 was loaded with so much olive oil, so much in the olive oil that it was clumping together. So what the experimenters did is they stirred it for 2 weeks to break up the clusters. They gave it to the rats. Like I said, the rats didn't die. They lived 90% longer. The word got out because on the internet, and people started demanding the C60. SES began manufacturing it and selling to them. And 4 years later, Marshall got a bottle of C60 in the mail, not knowing really what it was, took it, and his pain went away. Well, what Marshall and Martha quickly found out was this bottle of C60 they got, which was not dissolved in olive oil, it was dissolved in sunflower oil anyway, their pain went away. And when they went and they used the regular C60, which was everybody else was using, their pain came back eventually. As Martha said, all the C60 products did something, but only this one product kept the pain away and never came back as long as she took it. So that's when we began sending samples of C60 to laboratories to get them tested for molecule size, for density, things like this. And we were really trying to figure out why this one type of C60 worked and the other ones didn't. And now most of them, nobody rarely ever talked about pain, about going away with C60. And that's because they were just doing the C60 that was made according to the body rat study, and it didn't deal with pain. It didn't affect pain. This one brand did. And what happened is, and we believe it was Bucky leading us. What happened is that we had pretty much figured out what the issue was. It had to do with the size of the molecule. It had to do with, because C60 clusters and clumps, the bigger the clusters, the bigger the clumps, the more ineffective C60 came. And so what happened is that out of the blue, a chemist came into our group. He had been taking C60 by himself already for 6 months. And when he happened upon us, he realized that we were focused intensely on C60. And when he found out really what we had found regarding cluster, clumping, and particle size, he came up with a method of dissolving all the C60 and keeping them solubilized so the molecules were single and floated around. Some other people claim they have single molecules. We're the only ones that really do. And what he did to keep them solubilized, fully solubilized, he didn't want to put them in oil because they would recluster, reclump. He put them on a strip that you put it underneath the tongue. And so when Martha and I we're basically going to England, we're taking that C60, Fuller Life C60, because it is fully solubilized and it boosts your immune system. Because that's what the virus does. That's what all viruses do. In fact, viruses become deadly when they set off what is called cytokinic storms, all right, which is an immune response by the body to a viral infection, and the immune system, the response is so overwhelming it can kill you in the process. Antioxidants mitigate against this storm. We're not saying that it prevents it because nobody says it does. We believe that it does mitigate against it, and that's why we're taking it. But anyway, this is something that we're into. This is a crisis that Bucky Fuller saw. This is a crisis that through him and through Marshall, we now have something that we think is going to help us. And I recommend that those of you out there who are curious about this, go to my site, www.drshun.com, and there's I put the site's up there every day, and there's a click on about C60. On that, you can find out more about C60, why Fuller Life C60 is fully solubilized, far more effective. But I think what you're going to find out is that we are in the beginning of a crisis without precedent. And until now, we've skated pretty much, those of us who are still living in houses, those of us who did not become homeless after 2008, our little bubbles of comfort are being pricked. They're bursting right now. And I think this is where Bucky said we're going. And what I wish to do, if you want to continue following me, is that go to my website. I have the news. I'm going to be much more, Jeffrey is already on New Thinking Aloud. He's taped 6 more interviews with me. You can find me over there in Jeffrey's channels, New Thinking Aloud. Google that and my name. You're going to find out a lot about what I really think is going on. That question that gentleman asked in 2014, you know more than you're telling us, and I want to know why. I've told you a little bit today in this interview and the one before about what I believe I know. We all know different things. You know things that I don't know, but I know different things that I consciously have not spoken about until we hit this level in the crisis that we're into. We're going into the crisis without precedent. We're going there together. When we make it out, those of us that make it out, and the institutions that make it out are going to be transformed by the process. That is the purpose of crises. Good luck, and wait for my next interview. Thank you.